This is the Canon M6 Mark II. This camera can film up to 100 or 120 frames per second in full HD. But there are some downsides to this feature, and in this video we're going to talk about those downsides. And if you watch to the end of the video, I'm going to give you the formula on how you can calculate your target percentage if you want to manually slow down your footage. Coming up. Hi, my name is Roger, and on this channel we talk about cameras, tech gear and videography, and sometimes photography. And I would really appreciate an early thumbs up. Like I said, the Canon M6 Mark II, it has the feature of being able to shoot in 100 or 120 frames per second, depending if you're in a PAL or NTSC region, and it has the capability of filming in 120 frames per second in full HD. And not even my Canon EOS R has that feature of being able to shoot in 120 in full HD. The feature comes with some downsides. The M6 Mark II, this camera has an mic input. That really helps you get good quality audio in your videos if you connect an external microphone to the camera. Unfortunately, the camera does not record audio when you're in the 120 frames per second mode. Now this is probably something Canon has crippled the camera by. What are you doing here? You should be on Camera Conspiracies videos, not mine. Please go away. I'm not going to talk badly about the camera anymore. Doesn't have autofocus in 100. The lack of audio recording is probably just something that Canon has put into this camera on purpose to make the camera not compatible with other high-end cameras. I guess a firmware update could have fixed this, but anyway, that's how it is. But does it really matter that much that you're not able to record audio in 120 frames per second? Because when do you actually use 120 frames per second? Probably for a shorter amount of time, recording something that you know you want to slow down. You would probably just put on some background music to that footage anyway, so for me it's not been that big of a deal not being able to record audio when shooting in 120 frames per second. The next downside, or the next feature missing in 120 frames per second, is something that I actually miss, and that is you don't have autofocus when filming in 120 frames per second on the M6 Mark II. This is also probably a cripple hammer thing. I think he went away. This is probably just another thing that they have taken out on purpose so that the M6 Mark II doesn't compete with the higher end cameras. The way to get good focus when shooting in 120 frames per second is you should turn on the focus peaking assistance in the camera, and when you turn the focus peaking on, you either get red, yellow or blue colors on whatever's in focus, and when you try and change the focus, you see these colors changing position in the frame. So whatever the color is covering, that's what's in focus. But before you start recording in 120 frames per second, depending on what kind of focus method you're using, if you half press the shutter button before you start recording in 120 frames per second, the camera will focus on whatever the focus square is covering. And that's really helpful if your camera is locked onto a tripod and you only want to have your focus on one spot during the recording with the high frame rate. The third downside to 120 frames per second in the Canon M6 Mark II is when you shoot in 120 frames per second or 100 frames per second, the finished file that you get out of the SD card, it's already been compressed down to either 25 frames per second or 30 frames per second, depending on if you're in a PAL region or an NTSC region. If you're in a PAL region, it's 25 frames per second file. If it's in an NTSC region, you get a 30 frames per second file. If you don't know the difference between a PAL region and an NTSC region, you can go watch this video after this video. If you put your files into an NLE to make changes, you need to make sure that the timeline that you have in your NLE match the timeline of your already slowed down file. For me, in an PAL region, I usually use a 25 frames per second timeline anyway. So for me, it's not a problem because it's already been compressed down to a 25 frames per second file. So that file will match up with my timeline perfectly. The problem is when you're in an NTSC region. Normally, 24 frames per second timelines is looked upon as the cinematic timeline. And 24 frames per second is probably what most people are using in their NLEs if you're in an NTSC region. The problem with putting a 30 frames per second file into a 24 frames per second timeline is that you probably won't get that smooth slow motion that you are hoping for. So make sure that your timeline match up with your already slowed down file that you get out of the camera. And now the time has come for me to give you the formula on how you can calculate how much percentage wise you want to slow down your footage in your timeline. Depending on how many frames per second you have made your timeline in your NLE, you take that frames per second, let's use 24. If you have a 24 frames per second timeline, you take your 24 frames per second and then you divide that by the amount of frames per second that you have filmed your footage. So let's say you have 120 frames per second footage that's not been slowed down in the camera. Then you take 24 divided by 120 and you get 0.2, which is 20%. So 120 frames per second footage, you can slow that down to 20% if you have a 24 frames per second timeline. So that's the video for this week. I do hope you got something out of it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. I would really appreciate that. If you haven't subscribed and you want to see more videos like this, please hit that subscribe button. I would really appreciate that too. And leave a comment in the comment section down below. I love to talk to you guys down there. So that's it for me. Maybe I will see you in another video. Bye.